Her father never called it a trick. Instead, he described it as preparation for the cold. When she was 9, she made her first trip underground with him at their family farm in Telemark. By the end of October, the ground surface had already begun to freeze due to the first major frost of the season. But at a depth of about 1.8 meters below the old smokehouse's foundation, the temperature remained, according to her father, just above 4 degrees Celsius. She didn't yet understand the practical meaning of that temperature, but as she walked down the stone steps, she felt warmth rising towards her face. She remembered her father bending down beside a row of jars sealed with wax, his breath barely visible in the dim light of the lamp. "The soil holds on to summer's heat longer than we do," he said, laying his hand flat against the stone wall, fingers spread as if reading something. She wasn't able to grasp it yet. "Once you understand this, it takes months for it to cool. You stop fighting the winter. Instead, you start using what the earth naturally provides." She kept this information an untested lesson, a piece of knowledge in her memory for 23 years. It collected dust in a part of her mind she rarely accessed. That remained the case until the winter of 1,931 inches of river valley in northern Minnesota, when the temperature outside her home dropped to negative 39 degrees Celsius and stayed there for 9 days in a row. Before you continue, please subscribe and hit the like button. Your support matters more than you think. Her name was Marin Holst, and she had moved to Minnesota from Norway with her husband Anders in the spring of 1924. They had been encouraged by a cousin whose letters expressed cautious optimism about land prices. And the length of the growing season, the 32 hectares they bought next to a tributary of the Crow Wing River, turned out to be dependable ground. The northern slope was covered in forest, and hay grew in the low-lying areas. A clear stream flowed through it for most of the year. However, the cousin had not mentioned the winters. Or if he did, Marin hadn't fully understood what that word meant at such a northern latitude. Anders passed away in the summer of 1929. A burst appendix led to 4 days of worsening condition. No doctor reached him in time. He was 34 and Marin was 31. She had no relatives within a radius of 1,600 kilometers. After years of developing the property, she had no extra savings. Also, she had no strong reason to return to Norway. Even if she had gotten the money, she still owned the 32 hectares. She had a horse named Bjorn and a mixed-breed dairy cow called Kavist. She also had a woodshed filled with approximately 9 cubic meters of cut birch. Additionally, there was a root. A root cellar had been dug into the slope behind her house, which she had immediately recognized as dangerously inadequate. Measuring about 4.3 meters in length and 2.4 meters in width, its walls were made of stacked fieldstone. Its roof consisted of rough-hewn timber covered by 0.6 meters of packed earth. During a mild winter, its temperature ranged from 3 degrees Celsius to 6 degrees Celsius, cold enough to keep root vegetables and preserve goods in jars from spoiling. Yet that was barely sufficient during the winter of 1927. A 3-week period of severe cold had caused the cellar's internal temperature to drop to negative 6 degrees Celsius, freezing everything inside. She had not moved it closer to the house, and she had lost 45 kilograms of potatoes, 3 jars of pickled cabbage, and most of her dried apple supplies. She could not tolerate another such loss, especially now that she was managing everything alone. In the autumn of 1929, after Anders' death, as bleak financial news filled the radio broadcasts, she began her digging. The location was chosen with great care, a spot her father would have recognized immediately, situated at the northeast corner of the property. The rear wall of the woodshed was set against a small ridge, providing shelter from the prevailing northwest winds. This simple resting villiator, wide 5 meters wide and 3.7 meters deep, with a cedar shingle roof. Its south-facing side was left open for loading and fetching firewood. Anders built it in their second year together, and the ground underneath had never been disturbed. At first, Marin couldn't put her finger on why, but she felt this was the ideal location, a certainty that only strengthened as she continued her work. As the work progressed, the reason for her selection slowly became clear. This was truly the perfect place. The ridge rose behind it, and the compact, virgin subsoil underneath was protected by the shed's floor, insulating it from changes in surface temperature. The shed's floor shielded the subsoil from temperature swings, and its inconspicuous nature also made it ideal. The fact that it was the least likely spot to be discovered added to its suitability. She waited until the first week of September. The topsoil was still workable, and the air already carried the unmistakable cold of the coming winter. She then marked out a rectangular area, 2.7 by 4.3 meters, in the back of the shed under the stacked birch logs. Using a long-handled spade, she began digging, and the first 30 centimeters of soil came out easily. The top layer was dark, light, and crumbly soil, smelling of roots and fresh rain. But the following 30 centimeters were much denser and heavier. This was clay-heavy subsoil, coming up in dark lumps with a metallic smell typical of deep earth that had not seen sunlight for decades. When she hit the 90-centimeter depth, she exchanged her spade for a mattock, breaking the hard-packed layer with accurate, short strokes. She loaded the dugout soil into a wheelbarrow and pushed it about 27 meters away to dump into a hollow at the edge of the hayfield. Her daily schedule was 3 hours of work each morning and 2 hours each afternoon. For 11 days under the gentle September sun, she labored until the pit was 2.7 meters deep. She then lined its walls with flat field stones, a total of 160 of them, which she had been collecting from the creek bank since July. The stones were transported by wagon in 3 separate trips and then stacked near the shed. Over the summer, she dry-laid them carefully, fitting each one tightly against the earthen walls and packing coarse sand into every gap. The interplay of stone against earth and earth encasing stone embodied a principle her father had impressed upon her memory, much like his hand pressed against the Telemark wall. Stone slowly absorbs and releases heat, and an underground stone wall holds its temperature better than the air above. Resisting quick cooling, it stores and then radiates the warmth built up over summer, long after the ground surface is frozen. The floor got the same careful treatment. Tamped earth made level and flat. First, it was covered with 7.5 centimeters of coarse washed sand, which was then compacted smooth. She then set a second layer of smaller flat stones, each one preheated in a long bonfire at the edge of the field. She built the floor and carried it to the pit while still warm, wrapped in burlap, a stone floor, preheated by fire before being buried. It would hold its heat for more than one night, and it wouldn't fade even over several nights. The large thermal mass of 90 kilograms of fieldstone, placed at ground level, 2.7 meters underground, would keep a noticeable amount of that warmth for many weeks. The roof required the most careful planning. She used rough-cut pine boards 15 centimeters thick, spanning the 2.7-meter opening in 2 sections. A central beam, fitted into mortises carved into the stone walls, gave support. On top of the planks, she hand-packed 10 centimeters of the driest hay from the previous summer's harvest. It was layered like a thatched roof, dense enough to keep its shape, yet porous enough to trap pockets of still air, which makes hay an extremely effective, a natural insulator for any farm building. She spread a sheet of waxed canvas over the hay. It was repurposed from a grain tarp, with the edges overlapping by a full 30 centimeters on each side and tucked against the stone walls. Next, she placed approximately 30 centimeters of subsoil on top of the canvas. With her hands and feet, she molded it into a low arch, smoothing the surface until it looked like natural ground. After that, she restacked the birch wood on top, ensuring each split log was returned to its exact original spot. The stacks looked neat and ordinary, and the hidden door was concealed beneath the third row from the right. This consisted of a square section of pine boards measuring roughly 0.6 meters on each side, which could be lifted by means of a leather strap. It was invisible unless the logs were moved, and one knew where to look. To anyone gathering or stacking firewood in that shed, it all appeared unchanged. The floor seemed solid, and the logs were arranged in their customary rows. The building stayed exactly as it had always been. It stood in the same corner of the same property, serving the same purpose it had always served. This uniformity was also a deliberate part of the design. In the last days of September, she went down into the hole, guided by the light of a lamp. She carefully stored 63 kilograms of potatoes in burlap sacks, 27 kilograms of turnips, and 4 earthenware jars of salted pork, sealed with melted fat. Additionally, she put away 11 jars, each about 1 liter, of pickled beets and cabbage, 2 crocks containing lard, and a 23-kilogram bag of cornmeal inside a cedar chest. She had fitted a tightly sealed lid to keep out any moisture. Moreover, she stored a metal box containing $40 in banknotes. Wrapped in 2 layers of oilcloth, these supplies were everything she needed to survive a severe winter. She would not leave her property or spend money she didn't have. The neighbors noticed, as neighbors always do, that the Lindquist family to the north kept a courteous but distant attitude. They had been like this ever since. Marin politely declined Mrs. Lindquist's attempt to set her up with a widower from a neighboring county. An unspoken divide had grown between them after that event. To the south resided the Comedy brothers, younger bachelors who farmed together and observed many of Marin's actions. They noted it with the casual indifference of people busy with their own considerable problems. Ola Reinitsen, a Norwegian farmer who lived about 5 kilometers to the east. As the third generation of his family, he was the one who spoke out about what others had probably whispered in private. He had stopped his wagon at her driveway one August afternoon. He did this occasionally, just to pass the time, as men often do after a week of solitary reflection. He spotted the pile of excavated dirt located at the edge of the hayfield. He also noticed the creek stones stacked near the shed. He looked at it with the kind of expression one gives to something that doesn't fit the expected order. "Building something?" he asked. "Improving the storage," she answered, "under the woodshed." He made it sound more like a statement than a question, and she agreed, followed by a short silence. He turned his hat around in his hands, a gesture that gave him time to decide whether to express a thought or hold it back. He decided to stay quiet, urged his horse forward, and continued on his way. But 3 weeks later, through the typical channels of rural gossip, mainly the general store, and sometimes the feed mill, Marin heard that the phrase, "that Holst woman and her hole," had come up in public at least once. She found it didn't trouble her greatly. She always valued accomplishments over her reputation. October turned more severe, and November came with a gloomy, overcast sky. The birch trees lost their leaves quickly, and the fields changed from gold to gray to white in less than 14 days. The Crow Wing stream froze over in the second week of November, an unusually early event even for that area. During the waning afternoons of late autumn, Marin focused on essential tasks for either a comfortable winter or mere survival. She sealed the north-facing wall of her house where she felt cold air seeping in, and carefully oiled all the leather equipment in the barn to keep it from drying out and cracking. She completed splitting the wood she had harvested in summer, piling up about 14.5 cubic meters under the shed. The first difficulty arose in early December, though the worst weather was still weeks away, but it was already cold enough to send a clear signal. On the morning of 8 December, the thermometer attached to the north porch post showed minus 26 degrees Celsius. She waited until midday, then went to the woodshed, moved the birch logs, and lifted the trapdoor. The air rising from below was cool and a little humid, but it was not freezing or biting. She climbed down the 8 steps she had cut into the earth wall and stood in the underground room. She held her bare hand at chest height as she waited. She guessed the temperature was about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, compared to minus 26 outside. Far underground beneath a woodshed, shielded by 2.7 meters of soil, stone, compacted hay, and waterproof tarpaulin, winter seemed like a far-off story. She stopped there for a moment. The lamp's light revealed the crocks, jars, and the cedar box. The sacks of potatoes were still dry, and the lard, although firm, could be scooped easily. Nothing had shifted or frozen. Her thoughts wandered to the limestone walls in Telemark, the lamplight, and the cozy warmth that had wrapped her face when she was 9 years old. She pressed her palm against the surface. She climbed back up, closed the trapdoor again, put the birch logs back in place, and went inside to make her dinner. January began with exceptional harshness, a steady cold that never let up. Temperatures fell even further each night and stayed freezing all day, without the usual midday easing. By the morning of 14 January, the porch thermometer read minus 34 degrees Celsius. That evening it went down to minus 36. She used the battery-powered radio cautiously for 30 minutes every morning and evening. It reported that a high-pressure system had settled over northern Minnesota and a dense, continuous flow of Arctic air was coming down from Canada. The forecast was vague, only saying that temperatures would drop further. On 17 January, the morning reading showed minus 39 degrees Celsius. At such low temperatures, the moisture in your breath does not evaporate. Instead, it freezes into ice crystals and falls. A faint shimmer of ice appears in the air in front of you. Exposed skin goes numb in under 5 minutes. At night, the birch trees in the northern wood made noises like gunfire as their trunks split along the grain. The sap inside the frozen wood expanded faster than the wood fibers could bear. The stream, which had been entirely frozen for 2 months, made groaning noises under the severe new cold. As the ice grew thicker, the barn door hinges were frozen open on the morning of the 18th, taking 20 minutes of work to free them with a candle flame. Marin kept her house warm by using 3 heat sources. Those sources were the kitchen stove, the living room heater, and the small bedroom stove. To stop the water bucket from freezing completely, she hardly got any sleep at night, and her wood used was more than she had originally estimated. This extreme cold constantly drew heat out of the house through the walls. Just as a drain removes water, she carefully managed her supplies without any break. The living room stove was fed only twice a day, not 3 times. The kitchen stove was used only for cooking and for the hour afterwards. Each morning she checked the pit. By the 3rd day of the severe freeze, she went down the cellar steps in the pre-dawn dark with a lamp in one hand. She lifted her open hand upwards. Outside, the temperature reached 5 degrees Celsius, whereas indoors it plummeted to minus 39 degrees Celsius. Beneath the wood shed, the temperature had changed by less than 1 degree compared to December's reading. The stone floor felt cool but not frigid. The mud walls stayed dry, the potatoes remained hard, the lard was set, and the jars were unbroken. The whole system operated precisely as intended, upholding the separation between the surface world and the stored warmth below. It gradually gave back September's heat to January's darkness, asking nothing in return. She allowed herself a feeling that was neither true pride nor complete relief. It sat between these two, closer to recognition of precise awareness of something. As designed, the second problem appeared on the 9th day of the severe cold snap during the worst weather. She checked on calves 3 times each day, giving extra hay every morning and a bucket of heated water from the kitchen stove. She vigilantly observed the animals' breathing and posture. The barn, built with board and batten siding during their first year on the land, had no insulation except its walls and the animals' collective warmth. For normal Minnesota winters, it was sufficient for most of January's short cold snaps, those lasting only 4 or 5 days before easing. The barn's interior temperature remained between -9 and -7 degrees Celsius, a range that caused unease but did not endanger a mature animal used to the local climate. Upon opening the barn door on the morning of January 22nd, Marin immediately sensed something different. It wasn't the temperature, since that takes a moment to notice. Instead, it was the unique quality of air inside an overcooled building, heavy and still, a kind of silence that brought no comfort. The thermometer attached to the center post showed -13 degrees Celsius. Cavis stood by the far wall, head down, breathing shallowly, leaning her weight onto her forelegs. The water in the trough had frozen solid, despite the floating wooden piece Marin placed to prevent ice. The animal's legs were cold from hock to hoof. When Marin put her hand on Cavis' flank, the heat she felt was weaker than anticipated. The animal's body was struggling to maintain its core warmth, pulling energy inward and leaving the extremities to fend for themselves. The forecast called for -13 degrees Celsius, with no warming expected before the 24th. Although this animal had been well fed through autumn and was in good winter condition, it was not adapted for such extremes, especially not for 9 straight days. At the barn's doorway, Marin looked at the wood shed 9 meters away. Her gaze settled on the corner where the barn's east wall and the shed's west wall were just 1.2 meters apart. She and Anders had talked about enclosing this gap with a connecting passageway like some older farms in the valley had. However, they had never got around to finishing it. She looked at the gap between the barn and the shed, then at the thermometer. Then she made the kind of judgment typical in emergencies, not aiming for perfection, but for a sufficient solution using what was at hand. She brought down 2 whole hay bales from the loft, untied them, and spread the hay out further. She also had a 3-7-meter piece of waxed canvas, the same kind she had used earlier for the pit roof. In addition, she had 4 pieces of 5x 15 centimeters rough sawn lumber stored in the shed's rafters for future use, along with a roll of baling wire, a hammer, and a box of 8-penny nails. She built a barrier that stretched across the 1-2-meter gap between the two structures. It worked not as a solid wall but as a windbreak and an insulating layer. To block the gaps, the hay bales were tightly compressed and stacked. Afterwards, a canvas was stretched over and around them, then fastened with nails to the wooden walls on both sides. The 50x150 timber braces were placed diagonally to reinforce the entire building against the constant, horizontal wind gusts that swept around the north end of the ridge. This took 80 minutes to complete. Twice, her fingers went numb. Both times, she pressed her fingers against Quist's neck and held them there until sensation came back to her knuckles, all the while resting her cheek against the animal's warm side. She felt the horse's slow, regular breathing, and her work was simple and rough. She wasn't trying to heat the barn. Aside from the stove in the house, she had no other way to warm it. Lighting a fire inside a board and batten structure was dangerous. Her aim was to reduce the cold's entry by sealing the gap where the wind had been channeling through. By stopping the drafts, she prevented the rapid loss of residual heat, which was leaving the air faster than Christ's body could replace it. The principle of insulation is simple. Every sealed gap stops heat from escaping. Each extra layer between an animal and a wind chill of -37 degrees Celsius recovers warmth without any energy cost. By mid-afternoon, Marin relied solely on her hand, held at shoulder height, as her most reliable gauge. Marin estimated the barn had warmed to -10.5 degrees Celsius. Cavis was standing steadily on all four legs, breathing more deeply and regularly. Marin hurried 2 buckets of hot water from the stove, hugging them to maintain the heat. The horse drank both in long, slow swallows as dusk fell. The barn stayed at -10 degrees Celsius. Christ walked on his own to the hayrack, giving Marin the last confirmation she needed to head inside and sleep. The bitter cold broke on the 23rd. It wasn't a sudden change. Cold weather never ends abruptly in that valley in January. But something shifted during the night. That morning, the thermometer read -26 degrees Celsius instead of -37, which now felt almost pleasant. By the 28th, valley temperatures had risen to around -15 degrees Celsius. In early February, what longtime residents called the second winter began essentially an extension of the cold season. But this second winter wasn't as harsh as the first. When the roads finally opened, only Rhinason drove out, after hearing from the Link Fists that their root cellar was completely frozen. By the 12th day of the deep freeze, they had lost 2/3 of their stored vegetables. Farmer Hesse, about 13 kilometers to the east, had lost some livestock from the prolonged cold. He had suffered more losses than he was willing to say publicly. Several families in the valley apparently came through without serious issues, but had used up nearly all their firewood. Now they hurried to restock. Before March, Reinhardson stood in the yard, quietly studying the woodshed for a long time. Finally he asked, "Did your supplies survive?" Marin nodded once in confirmation. As is common for men whose worries are proven true but difficult to express, his eyes went back to the shed, its outside still plain and unchanged. The birch logs were piled normally, and the cedar shingle roof held its usual ridge of packed snow, echoing every other roof in the valley. "Your cow? She's doing well." A different stillness settled. He took off his cap and turned it over in his hands. He rarely apologized or gave unnecessary explanations. Yet the way he held his cap, his gaze fixed on the shed, this conveyed an unspoken feeling, the closest he ever came to apologizing or explaining. Pointing to the opening under the shed, he said, "So, your father taught you to build that?" She remembered the root cellar in Telemark lit by a lamp, the rows of wax-sealed jars, the scent of limestone and packed earth, and a hand pressed firmly against the wall. "He gave me the idea," she said. "I had to work out the details myself." Ryerson put his cap back on, said he'd meet her at the general store, and guided his horse toward the main road. "We need to talk," he returned 3 weeks later, accompanied by his eldest son. Answering those questions took most of an afternoon. That spring, they built their own version under the south side of their tool shed, following Moran's instructions as closely as the uneven land allowed. It survived the next winter perfectly. The underground chamber beneath Marion's woodpile kept working for 11 more winters. She improved it twice. First, she extended the stone floor by 0.6 meters on the east side, increasing its thermal capacity. She felt this was not enough during the coldest nights of its first real test. She also intended to add a ventilation pipe. A short piece of reused stovepipe with a damper was installed. This allowed controlled airflow. While it prevented significant heat loss, the next change came after a summer when condensation formed on the canvas ceiling, soaking into the hay insulation. This compressed the hay, reducing its efficiency. The next fall, she replaced the hay with dry, compressed moss from the northern forests. She noticed the new material performed better, being denser and more resistant to compaction. By the end of the 1930s, the structure under that woodshed was essentially the same in its basic design. Its components and intricate design philosophy matched what her father had shown her in Norway, which itself had been built by his own father. It represented a practical refinement of knowledge widely understood in certain Scandinavian regions for many generations before it was ever written down. No patent, blueprint, or newspaper article existed. Only knowledge passed from person to person. From a Telemark root cellar to a Minnesota woodshed, conveyed by a woman on a chilly hillside, wielding a mattock, and vividly recalling a hand pressed against a stone wall. In 1948, Marion sold the farm and moved to Duluth to live near Ames. The couple who bought the property, young people from Wisconsin, equally hopeful and inexperienced, discovered the pit during their second winter there. In their second winter, they accidentally found the pit when they lifted the hatch while reorganizing the firewood. It was perfectly preserved, the stone floor, the walls, and the canvas and moss ceiling. The discovery revealed it to be entirely intact, the stone flooring, the walls, the canvas and moss ceiling, and the 8 steps carved into the ground. They then contacted Marin, asking what it was and how it worked. Her brief 3-paragraph reply ended with this statement: "The soil holds on to summer's warmth longer than we do. It remembers the heat for months. Its cooling process takes place over several months. Understanding this idea makes winter no longer an enemy. You are no longer fighting the cold. The struggle against the cold disappears. You are simply using the Earth's natural resources." For 30 years, the pits served them each winter until the farm changed hands. Once again, the couple's daughter spent her formative years helping to load it every September and empty it every January. On one occasion, she discussed its importance with a neighbor, describing it as the most trustworthy feature throughout the whole property. It was more dependable than the heating system, more stable than the driveway, and even more accurate than the forecast. Its reliability never let us down, always proving trustworthy. If this story strikes a chord with you, feel free to subscribe and share it. Go ahead and follow and pass it on. There are plenty more tales like this, and they all deserve to be remembered.